Hello, I'm Toycat, and the world's two largest economies are currently about to start a trade war. Now, you don't need the 50th person telling you what the effects of tariffs are. You can Google "Are tariffs good?" and you'll find out that yes, tariffs are great, especially if you don't mind stopping reading halfway through a headline. And so instead, I want to discuss the actual political structure behind the US and the EU, because the US is known for having a weird way they elect their leader, but what's even stranger is the EU isn't a country, and so the way that they dictate trade policy is even stranger in my opinion. And I want to talk about which of these two systems is going to be better, because the reason this comes up was kind of this article talking about how, did you know, the EU was going to actually tariff bourbon as a particularly targeted tariff against the US, but in response, Trump said that he would threaten 200% tariffs on the EU wine and spirits, and so what actually happened was the EU backed down. This is interesting because it's a direct reversion of what happened in 2002. If you haven't heard, I'll use the Wikipedia article to summarize this briefly. The President George W. Bush, the last Republican president before Trump, as weird as that is to say about someone from 2002, but basically he wanted to place tariffs on imported steel. The tariffs were something that were kind of asked for by the steelmaking industry because more than 30 of those had filed for bankruptcy, and they basically argued, look, everyone who wants to buy steel, they don't buy US steel because it's not cheaper than foreign steel, and they keep buying the cheapest price good that is the same quality, and so make sure that you tariff that at the border so you can protect us as an industry. This is something which is notable because George W. Bush was a very pro free trade president, but he decided to go along with it anyway, and they argued it was a safeguarding response, and they had to protect against sudden surges of imports of steel. What happened in response was interesting because in particular the EU was very offended by this, and so they had very, very strongly targeted tariffs. Basically, they argued the reason you're protecting the steel industry is because you want to be re-elected, and so they targeted tariffs on particular swing state products. So, for example, Michigan makes up less than 3% of the US population, substantially less if I know my numbers correctly, but despite that, they make up substantially more than 3% of your odds of being elected as that same president. This is because the majority of people live in safe states, but Michigan and Florida are not safe states. Florida is not the biggest state to get your electoral votes to become president, but it is the biggest, or it was at the very least, the biggest state you needed to win, and so if Floridians feel like you're doing a bad job for Florida, if Michiganders feel like you're doing a bad job for them, and the same is true for every other swing state, you won't be elected again. In other words, using if your enemy is using politics to try and hurt you on trade, you can use your trade to try and hurt them on politics, and the EU kind of effectively, in 2005, the whole thing kind of undid itself, and it all backed down, and the argument, looking back, we can easily analyze and say that, yeah, the costs of these safeguarding measures outweighed their benefits in terms of aggregate GDP and employment. There wasn't actually they were lifted in December 2003. It was a very, very short-lived tariff situation, and it's notable because the EU basically got the US to back down, which is sort of what's happening in reverse here. The EU wanted to tariff bourbon kind of as a targeted tariff, and so what the US did in response was say, okay, we'll tariff your wine and spirits, and this kind of strikes at the heart of how the EU functions, because one particular country in the EU is particularly, in this case France, is particularly affected by this one. France has a the wine and spirit sector is huge in France. I think one of the biggest alcohol companies in the world, Pernod Ricard, is there, but also champagne and also all the other things. Basically, they would be bearing all of the cost of this tariff, and so in response, they wanted to get it back down. But this is something which is, again, the US got the EU to do something by taking advantage of the EU's weakness in that each of their member states do have, like a say in how this works. And so if you target one of them in particular, maybe the most politically sensitive, which is what France has proven to be time and time again. No offense, France. Actually, offense, France. But this is something that I think, when it comes to the EU defense deal, the same thing is true there, right? The reason that we do not have a deal between the UK and the EU is because France wants access to fishing waters as part of any deal. They're like, I don't care if this is about defending ourselves from literal existential threat. If we don't have access to cod off the coast of Skegness, then I don't want to sign that deal whatsoever. And so, France is a very politically sensitive country for all sorts of reasons that I think comes up a lot in the world, and you're probably familiar with, but this then raises the question of which political structure is better. I would argue, and I think this is something I've argued for a long time, the US's system of using the electoral college isn't a bad thing because it's unrepresentative. That you could argue is a feature, not a bug. debate for Americans, not for me. But one of the downsides of, say, Trump's 2016 election is that he was elected by very tiny margins, not in the electoral vote, but in all of the states where he won it. In Wisconsin, he was elected by 11,000 votes, which means that all it takes is if you can convince 5,600, let's just round up, if you can convince 6,000 Michiganders, this is not Wisconsin. Oh, see, this is why you target Michigan with your tariffs, huh? And this is why it's worth protecting Michigan with your tariffs. But if you just convince 6,000 Michiganders who voted for Trump to vote for the next Democratic candidate, then you get the state back and you get 16 votes. You do the same thing in Wisconsin. This is Wisconsin. But in this case, you need 23,000 votes. So if you convince 12,000 Wisconsiners who voted for Trump to vote for the next Democratic candidate, you can win this state too. This is basically the logic that led to Florida swinging back and forth over and over again. All it takes for the next Democratic candidate to win Florida is to convince 3% of Floridians, and then you get 27 electoral votes. There is a huge disproportionate say that swing state voters have inside of US elections, and this is why, you could argue, even though Trump got 304 votes, he lost the election again to a very similar margin that he gained it to, and then why, without really anything substantial happening to his vote share, he got 74 million votes in 2020, and then he got, 77 million in 2024, and notably, it's like, oh yeah, so all those 3 million votes is all it takes to go from losing by a decent margin to winning by a decent margin, right? And so this is the problem with the way the US system is set up. You could argue that, so here we are, MS Paint diagrams, we're back. The way the US works is it's split into states, right? And because the western states are the easiest ones to use, let's just split this into squares, shall we? Okay, this is what US states look like. I'm going to pretend that there's only 4 states and that they look like that. I hope that this is a fine representation of your country. But each of these states has a number of votes in them, right? And so this is an interesting thing because each of those states theoretically can pick their own way they vote for the president, but actually not. So each of those states is then elected by the people. We'll have the people be represented by, actually, let's have the eagle represent the people. No, that's going to represent the country. So we'll have a person be over here. He's a red person if he's in the US, and he's going to be a blue person if he's in the EU. So what's really interesting is basically having democratic power is useful. Democracy is a really good system in good times, but a lot of people feel like democracy has flaws during bad times. Is a trade war as bad as a real war? Whole interesting debate there. But the reason behind this is in the case of a trade war, right? The US believes that their steel industry is more important than their orange industry or their car industry, although probably not the car industry. But you get the idea that but if your median voter cares more about their Floridian oranges than they care about the steel in another state, then the weakness becomes, can these people have a direct say? So my question here is, do you think a better system to set up your government by is the US one, where you're at the mercy of the people who live in very small swing states, or the European one? Now, the European system, I think anyone who tries to understand this, even people who are very deep into the political world, aren't going to quite perfectly understand it, but there is a president of Europe. But actually, there's 3 presidents of Europe. I'm kind of lying. There's the president of the council, the president of the parliament, and the president of the commission. But this is usually stated as the executive head of Europe, right? Ursula von der Leyen. She used to be a German politician of note. Now she's a European politician of note. And so she leads the European Commission, which is broadly representative of the member states of the EU. And then, so each of those 27 states has a vote on various issues, which means that the way it works in America is each of the states vote, and then the collective of all of their opinion becomes what the country has to do by itself. In Europe, the way it works is each of the member states are very different. The UK, previously the UK, or Belgium. We're just going to pretend there's 5 countries in the EU. This is what the flag for one of the countries looks like. This is what the flag for one of the other countries looks like. This is what the flag for one of the other countries look like. It's great in Europe. The tricolor makes your life really easy. There's one sideways tricolor, and then there's Spain, which is like that with a little eagle in the middle or something. What is in the middle of the Spanish flag? I can't picture it right now. But anyway, so let's now color these flags in just to make sure they feel accurate. So that's red, that's red, that's red, that's red, and that's red. There we go. So that is, actually, it's not quite right. Let's put some yellow there, and there, and there. There we go. We've made up some countries in the EU, and they all are slightly different, I'm pretty sure. We'll make that. There we go. There we go. 5 different countries. So the way it works in Europe is that basically every single country has its own elected politicians that work by its own way. So the citizens of country A elect themselves. And then there's actually different citizens for country B and different citizens for country C and D. And then instead of taking their collective shared opinion on who the president should be, as people, you take their country's collective shared opinion. And so instead of all of the people getting to vote between A and B, all of the people are voting between their own A and Bs, and then their A and Bs vote more indirectly for the EU. This is one of the reasons people argue it's a less democratic system, because by God is this more complicated than that, right? Like just... And, when you add in the fact that it's not even you need a majority of countries, a lot of EU issues base not on qualified majorities, but on absolute majorities. Every single one of these member states from... Also, this is Spain. What is it on their flag? They've got a... It's a lion, actually. It's not an eagle at all. I don't know who I was mixing them up with. Also, it's sideways. I think I messed that one up greatly. There's some nice pillars on there. Pluribus vitra. But anyway, so... the question that I want to ask is, do you think it is better or worse to have an indirect democracy? My instinctual response on a I think that people should rule themselves level is, oh yeah, the more indirect layers you have, the trickier it is to vote out a politician, and the worse that is for a system as a whole. And in general, I think that is my belief even in hard times, if I was to actually come down to it. But one of the benefits of having someone who is so politically immune this way is that ultimately, as long as all of the countries vaguely think they are doing the right thing, then they continue to have their power. Indeed, this is one of the things that a president inside of, say, the United States has is, if Trump's situation was happening in a parliamentary democracy, Parliament would probably at this point start to say, should you be doing that? Because, the US is meant to have, in theory, a president who's elected that way, and then actually you have a bunch of people who elect in this is Congress here. In theory, the president is meant to be certain issues only, right? And the Congress is meant to do a bunch of things, which is actually how the EU is meant to work too. The EU is meant to be like, okay, there's just a little guy way up there in the corner, and the US is meant to be, there's just a little eagle way up there in the corner, right? But what actually happened over time is that, just slowly but surely, the US power is growing, and the same thing is happening in Europe. And is that a good thing too, is the interesting question. Is it better to have a big strong eagle, a big strong, I don't know which Wojak this is, but is it better to have a big strong leader, or is it better to actually leave that power up to your individual people? Because that, in general, it works. People deciding for themselves can make much better decisions, right? If not on a individual human being level, like I hope you would agree, then at least on the community level, like the people of... Let me pick a town, actually. The people of, Carolina Forest or Conway, South Carolina, they probably know what they like. And they might have opinions that, the way that we make steel the best over here is by, the way that we could make steel work great is if we could, not have any of that foreign steel in here. But, as an independent community, they could say, no Japanese steel in Conway. But, first of all, that would be insane, actually. I think when it comes to international trade, we kind of break things. But at the very least, Conway should be able to decide, how should we be able to open up another hop and witch over here? And at the very most, they should be able to decide, what are their laws? What do they think about murder? What do they think about, all these sorts of, speeding? Do they want to have what do they think about the driving age? If Conway doesn't mind people who are 14 years old driving, then maybe they shouldn't. Or if Conway wants to say, you're not a real adult till you're 27, you shouldn't be able to drive till that age, are they allowed to have those crazy opinions? Or should that actually go to South Carolina? Should South Carolina decide? Or actually, is that too sensitive for an individual country? For an individual state or member state? And should that go to the wider federal union? And the interesting thing is that countries are more and more centralizing, especially as threats become more serious. To put it this way, Russia is made up of so many individual little, oblasts, right? I think that's the easiest way to simplify Russia's internal divisions. There are so many little oblasts that make up Russia, and is it a good thing that basically all power is centralized in Moscow? Yes, if you want to invade your neighbor, having all that power centralized in Moscow is great. You can, you don't say to the people of Kazan or the people of Bratsk, you don't say, hello friends, do you think that we should take some territory from our good friend Ukraine? They might say, I'm not really that big on it. But if you say, good news, Bratsk, you are sending 300 soldiers to fight for the good cause that we've gotten involved in, it's, things work. The autocratic order is better for getting things done, but worse at getting things done that people want. And so, is it a good thing that Canada is so decentralized and the US is increasingly more centralized? Or is it, what is more important, I guess? Because if you think that the most important thing is getting things done, then the fact that the US has been centralizing more and more around the president, which, by the way, again, I think is the actual thing that people should be caring about. In my lifetime, the US president has gone from oh yeah, there's the person who leads the US, it's kind of fun, but they don't dictate policy by themselves, right? You don't want to be dictating anything if you're just the leader of a federation to oh yeah, the person who leads the US literally gets to decide on everything, in my opinion. In a weird way, the campaigning for they get to decide everything has become the power of the president. Whether that should be the case is, again, for Americans to decide for themselves. But the same thing has to then happen in Europe. Right now, Europe is very, very decentralized. But as more and more hard times are coming, Europe is coming closer together. And so, even though it is a big opinion of your boy Mr. Trump here, that the reason the EU was formed was to screw over the US, effectively, by starting a trade war, I think that he is actually creating a more unified Europe. I think that if it weren't for the Russia situation, right, and if it weren't for the current tariff situation, I think more and more Europeans would be saying, why is it that we have to have weird rules on, standardization of this and that? Why is it, all of these big questions would start to raise, as during times of peace, I think independence and small countries work great, and during times of difficulty, you want to be part of a strong alliance. This is something very interesting, which I guess I just want to finish this video by saying, which system is better? I think they're both a little bit wild, personally, being British and not having to deal with either, thankfully. But I do think that we need to have a real discussion about, can you ever have 300 million people all represented by one guy? Whether it's an eagle or a wodjak, whether it's an orange man or a German woman, is it ever right that one person should have a great deal of power over that many people, or is that just the necessity in a world where, well, one man has a lot of power over that many people on the other side of the ocean? I don't know. That's my kind of takeaway from this video, is I don't think that either system is inherently better. But I do think that, weirdly, the more democracy you have, the weaker you are to a country that knows how to exploit it, if your democratic holes are well known about. I think in the UK, for example, we do have a similar system of swing, places. And so it means that no politicians are that bothered about what's happening in Wales. They're probably just going to vote for Labour anyway. No politicians are that bothered about what's happening, down in the southeast of England. I think it's mostly safe Conservative seats with the occasional Labour one. And the same is true for central London. I moved from one of the most marginal seats in the UK to I moved to one where literally it doesn't matter who I vote for. It doesn't matter if I'm pro-Labour, anti-Labour. It doesn't matter what my opinions are. I'm gonna have a Labour politician because I chose to live in this little circle right here. But the interesting thing about this is it means that some places get more campaigning and more attention. But as soon as your domestic politicians know about that and it becomes public information, in the world of information, it also becomes international news. If you're the US and you know that picking on France, given that EU trade policy is shared, picking on France is a particular good way to shut down wider EU trade discussions, you might just realize that maybe that's a good place to start. If you realize, I guess, should we take away France's voting rights? That's where this video is really ending on. But more seriously, the same is true for Florida. Florida got to decide so much of US policy, and now they're not a swing state, it's the Rust Belt deciding. And what the Rust Belt, Michigan, Wisconsin, etc., decide is we are willing to go through some international issues in exchange for maybe some slightly better. The Michigan hand thing, I met someone from Michigan, they're like, oh, this is my state. It doesn't look like a hand at all. It looks more like a cactus to me. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed today's video. There's a town called Cadillac. Do you think it's named after the Cadillac, or is Cadillac named after the town? Anyway, thank you for watching. I think this video has reached its point of not having any extra value. And yeah, I do intend to... I think a lot of the news is stuff I'm going to zone out and instead focus on the more fun discussions that come around it. So that's what we'll do here. Thank you for watching. Second channel, don't care. Goodbye. There's a big tower in the middle of here that's named after one of the big... GM Renken. Look at this. Look at this is the GM building. It's it looks like a video game. It's so cool. Anyway, thank you. Goodbye.